this is one aspect of the research that I'm doing at the moment, which is concerned with business power and how it operates in Ireland to influence economic policy, and specifically looking at taxation policy. So within that literature, there's kind of three strands of modes of power that are talked about. Instrumental, which is kind of related to lobbying and that kind of influence. Structural, which Manolis will talk a bit more about as well, and instrumental, but the one I want to kind of focus on is discursive, okay? So, discursive power basically is about influencing policies and political processes through the shaping of ideas and norms. It's kind of an ideological power, okay? So it starts kind of earlier at a broader level within the kind of influence sphere. So there's just a quote here: it involves a more subtle and perhaps smaller scale kind of power than any of these, presence at multiple levels in society and placed in multiple conversations, which allows a set of voices to be heard and a set of interests to be taken seriously. Okay. So research that's concerned with discursive powers look at kind of how interest groups fund studies, conduct conferences, to shape public values, also how there's materials distributed to schools and colleges to influence education, and workshops within workplaces to influence workers as well, and finance and think tanks. One thing that's not really mentioned, or it's implicit but not really directly mentioned within that literature too much, is the actual media itself and the role that they play. So I kind of take a critical political economy approach to the media, which is kind of broadly based on Herman and Chomsky's idea of the propaganda model. It's also later adapted by writers like Mark Chesney, Alex Carey as well, and guys that look at that from a critical perspective, and they basically argue that the media plays a complicit role in reinforcing dominant power structures in society. So in Ireland, one of the big groups that we kind of look at is the Independent News and Media, which operates in 22 countries, has over 200 print titles, 130 radio stations, etc. The propaganda model itself would argue basically that due to advertising, that the companies will basically are funded primarily through advertising nowadays compared to what it would be in the past, and as such they rely on that from corporate sources, which have the most amount of money spent, and they're going to be less critical of them basically. And a lot of the sourcing then is drawn from similar ranks of official experts, financial experts, and business interests as well, and the fact that they're actual corporations in themselves. Okay, so what I want to talk about is Ireland's corporation tax and how business power operates relating to that. So there's kind of four aspects that are identified in literature related to Ireland's corporation tax, and that's the headline rate itself of 12.5%, the corporate transfer pricing rules, Ireland's tax treaties and membership of the European Union. The tax treaties in the European Union membership kind of create a sort of legitimacy around Ireland's corporate tax system that can be used to justify basically, or to argue that it's not part of other tax havens that are considered around the world, and it also provides a market for companies to operate within Ireland. Right. So business views about the corporation tax system in Ireland is that it's cornerstone of our industrial policy, focused on job creation, investment, need to remain competitive. Basically, any changes will have dire economic consequences in terms of job losses and capital flight, and that foreign direct investment is the way to develop the economy. However, they've become more concerned with reputational costs, particularly with the international media taking focus on Ireland lately, and that's due to some of the criticisms. So, like for example, the American Chamber of Commerce will highlight investment in Ireland, the amount of jobs it's created. The fact is, their investment is 26% of GDP, 73% of all foreign direct investment in Ireland comes from the US, and it has a big impact on exports as well. So criticisms then that have arisen over the last number of years are focused on different investigations that have taken place. For example, the US Senate investigation, which labelled Ireland as a tax haven, the EC Commission investigations, which basically have said that Apple and the Irish state authorities, or the incentives that would be given to them, constitute state aid. And then the ongoing BEPS investigation by the OECD is putting a lot of pressure on, particularly in relation to the Double Irish, to close it, which they did in the last budget. So Jim Stewart from Trinity is one of the key kind of critique, well, economists is kind of critiquing the system as it is, and he's used basically US Bureau of Economic Analysis stats to show that the effective rate is goes basically 2.2%. So there's evidence saying that, like, Google has booked 41% of its 2012 global revenues in Ireland, similarly with Facebook. And this is done basically through moving profits into subsidiaries in Bermuda, the Cayman Islands. Again, the funds industry in Ireland is massive, so 2.8 trillion of assets are under administration in Ireland. Basically 40% of the world's administered alternative investment funds are in Ireland. Then the argument about jobs as well is one that's raised again about what's generated from jobs. But from this diagram you can see that something is happening with, if you look at, you can't really see it too clearly here, but from 2000 up to 2010, the amount of employment created by foreign direct investment has nearly flatlined. It's increased a little bit. Prior to that there was a big increase, but since 2000 it's pretty much flatlined. But at the same time, income reported by Irish subsidiaries of US companies has gone up over nearly 2,500% from 1990. Okay, so there is money being moved through Ireland. If we look at the investment list from the Central Bank of Ireland, it shows that basically the three highest countries where inward and outward investment is coming from is Bermuda, Luxembourg, Netherlands, United States and the United Kingdom as well are also high. And that, this is just a brochure from Arthur Cox when they're advertising basically SVP. It's kind of a way of looking at how we see Ireland and basically in kind of put assets in, wash it of tax through Ireland and move it on elsewhere. Which comes to the Double Irish. I'm going to focus on two aspects of the corporation tax, Double Irish and the financial transaction tax. So basically this is just a nice little diagram of how it operates in Ireland. So the arrangement is used to lower corporate tax liability. A strategy uses payments between related entities to shift income from a higher tax country to a lower tax country. Basically, Ireland does not levy tax on income booked in subsidiaries of Irish companies that are outside of the state. So the way this is set up, you can avoid basically paying the headline rate of 12.5%. So business views on this have changed over time. Before, they were saying that it wasn't really an issue. There was a number of PwC reports done that basically said that the way that Jim Stewart and others were looking at the documents are looking at the evidence, basically showed that, or wasn't a kind of a good way to look at it, and that effectively the effective rate was about 11.9%. But it has changed over time. So Fergal O'Rourke, who works for PwC and was a tax advisor with the American Chamber of Commerce, basically said, just in May on, is clear our corporate residency rules have been identified as an issue that needs to be addressed from a reputational perspective. If we accept this principle, the only issue we're debating is timing. Does Ireland benefit from addressing the issue before it is forced upon us? I believe that the balance of advantages lies in Ireland dealing with it on a proactive basis. So basically in the budget, they've closed the Double Irish and they've introduced what's knowledge paying box, which will have an effective rate of about 6.5%, but it's also being investigated by the Commission at the moment in relation to England actually on its legitimacy as well. Okay, so critical views of the Double Irish basically say it's a loss of revenue to Ireland and to the global south. It creates a race to the bottom in terms of corporate tax, that companies are paying less and less and less, and it's playing countries off each other so that they can basically pay less. And also that this model is an unsustainable way of developing the economy long term. So Dr. Sheila Killeen from Chemie Institute in Limerick said Ireland's tax model clearly does not do enough to protect vulnerable countries from tax revenue losses. Specifically, Ireland should adjust its transfer pricing regime to properly protect impoverished countries from losing tax revenue and close domestic tax loopholes that may facilitate capital flight from impoverished countries. Again, that has been mentioned a lot in the international press previously to this, but not so much in the Irish. Then the other issue was the financial transaction tax. Okay, so that's basically just a tax on financial institutions, charging 0.1% against the exchange of shares and bonds and 0.01% across derivative contracts. So the arguments against that from business groups in Ireland have been that the FTT is predicted to impact adversely on GDP, the households and non-financial businesses will be negatively affected. There's also mixed experiences of national FTTs, with Sweden, for example, abolishing it. The director of the Financial Services Ireland, Bryan, has basically said, "It's clear that Ireland made the right decision in staying out of any FTT. The review shows that the FTTs hurt every country that introduces one. Whatever is raised by the financial transaction tax is ultimately paid by the real economy and increased costs for business, lost jobs and lost payroll and corporate taxes." In Ireland, there's other groups that have been critical of the corporation tax. So, for example, Social Justice Ireland basically have said that there's no justification for insisting that lowest paid workers must make a large contribution through paying more tax, while the profitable corporate sector can escape without making any contribution to Ireland's rescue. And as such, they propose an effective rate of 6.5% in 2014 budget submissions. Similarly, Iklu and Erie have all similar measures to raise revenue without affecting the headline rate of 12.5%. The argument for the FTT then is supported by a lot of groups in Ireland, basically SIPTU, Impact, Christian Aid, there's a list of them, there are different groups that are involved in a campaign by Claim Our Future. They argue basically, like Social Justice Ireland's points, that basically the sector should pay a certain contribution. Also, there's too little regulation and supervision of the sector, and to generate additional revenue for the budgets. And also because of large management and remuneration packages within the financial industry, that they should make a contribution as well. So I've looked at corporate tax in the media in a few different ways. These are just provisional results that I'm working on, so it's only up until the 31st of October this year. I'll continue that until after the finance bill has been announced next year, when that's done. So there's 3 different search types I've done. The first one, corporate tax, is 385 articles. I went through the one in double Irish, so 104 articles, and the one for financial transaction tax is 83 articles. So basically what I found across the board was that in general the articles, well, a lot of them are very defensive of the corporate tax regime in Ireland. There is critical voices, but a lot of them are defensive of it. In relation to double Irish, most of the articles were in 2014, so there's kind of a mix going on where there's people that are actually now supporting it when the discourse shifts by business. And then there's a lot of voices that are critical of introducing the financial transaction tax, with some articles defending and saying it's a good idea or supporting it. So the content of the articles predominantly focuses on the headline rate. 74% of the articles mention this. It's generally a lot of the time framed in a national interest against Germany and France. Ireland doesn't want these changes, Germany and France do, rather than different interest groups or class-based analysis. And it's challenging the imposition of these different changes. Okay. As a result, the kind of key themes is their loss of jobs, investment, competitiveness and capital flight. The critical articles kind of focus on the need for the financial sector to pay their fair share, the race to the bottom market, and the unsustainable nature of the FTT, or the FDI as an economic model. So there's some headlines to show you how dominant the discourse around the actual headline rate is. So there's very strong language here. You can see we should lay down our lives to keep 12.5%. Suicide if we give in to the EU on taxes. Changing our corporate tax rate will be economic suicide. EU reform plan will deliver a fatal blow to the economy. Because very strong language, you can see there. In relation to the double Irish, it's not really talked about until the government basically proposed to change it on business interests. Just prior to the budget started making some commentary on this. But up until that, it's not really discussed in the Irish media, even though it is internationally and it's discussed among different critical academics and different NGO groups as well. So you can see basically prior to 2014, most of the articles were opposed to closing the double Irish. After that, there's a shift, right? But this discourse shift basically is kind of seen, well, in even early or mid-summer kind of 2014. We've got jobs at risk. IBEX warning against this, different tax advisors, US multinationals are warning against it. But then around September they seem to change tack and basically they're proposing that you make a preemptive move on this and scrap the double Irish. Then we start to see that it won't kill tech jobs, that we need to tackle the corporate issue. So they've basically decided that there is an issue around reputational cost that, from what I can see, that seems to be work that we'll have to deal with this issue, and there's a huge pressure from the EC and the OECD. In relation to financial transaction tax articles, it's kind of quite dominant when it's been dominant within Europe. At the same time, it kind of dies off in 2014, as being discussed in these articles. Again, a lot of the articles are opposed to the idea of introducing this. Again, for various reasons that we mentioned already, to do with job losses and basically loss of investment as well and capital flight. Just on the authorship and sourcing of these articles that I looked at, it's kind of very difficult to do it in terms of opinion pieces because there's really not that many. So over all the articles that I've looked at, vast majority are written obviously by journalists. The next biggest block is kind of the financial sector, economists, business representatives, then politicians, academics, trade unionists, NGOs were a small block of that. Then within those articles that journalists write, the sources that they quote within them, I measure basically, a lot of the time they're relying on financial experts and economists, and politicians, basically. And also academics at times. It's a similar kind of situation for the financial transaction tax articles. Then just one other search group that I did was of these 4 different interest groups: IBEC, Chamber of Commerce, ICDU, and Social Justice Ireland. Just looking up corporate tax articles. And you see that overall, with the 3 papers that I looked at, there's a lot more articles basically for IBEC and American Chamber of Commerce than there is for ICDU and Social Justice Ireland. And they're the topics that IBEC and the Chamber of Commerce are concerned with are related to competitiveness, jobs, investment, to deal with tax avoidance, but mostly to defend them, that we're not taking part in them. So just in conclusion, discursive power basically is an important and often overlooked form of business power. So a lot of the time people focus on the instrumental and structural power of business. Discursive power is kind of a little bit difficult to look at as well. So, and it's not as direct. So while PR campaigns are important for any actor seeking to influence decision making, the role of the media as representative agents of wealth and power should also be highlighted. So from my research, I would say that the mainstream print media in Ireland, from what the topics I've looked at here, and I'm doing this broader for other areas as well, is generally supportive of business viewpoints over other actors in society. And this has been found in other research recently on the Irish media. So it's important to analyse discursive power, but in conjunction with instrumental and structural power. Just having ideological power is not really going to get you what you want. There's other aspects of power that are used there. Okay, that's 20 minutes, so...
Thank you very much, John. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the FTT policy, the financial transaction tax, or as you said, Sean, Robin Hood tax, at the EU level, okay? So this is a policy which has been debated now for roughly 3 to 4 years at the European Union level. And essentially what I'm going to argue is that the fate of the FTT and how it's ultimately turned out is actually another example of regulatory reform being thwarted by the political power of financial actors, okay? So, if we look at the literature, it's well established at this point that 6 years since the crisis, the regulatory reform process that was promised in 2008, 2009 hasn't been fulfilled, okay? And this is particularly the case at the EU level, and there's a number of examples you can cite of policies that have been either postponed, abandoned, or watered down, okay? For example, hedge fund regulation, over-the-counter derivative regulation, shadow banking, too big to fail regulation, Basel III, all these policies, you can see that how they were promised when they were first introduced, it hasn't transpired that way. They've been watered down or abandoned in many cases, okay? So it's well established that regulatory reform hasn't transpired, but it's also well established that one of the key variables in this is the operation or the exercise of financial political power. Okay, so there's other factors as well, institutional gridlock, national state priorities, but it's coming to the fore more and more in the literature that financial political power is a key variable. And as John was mentioned, we can roughly see financial political power over 3 dimensions, okay? Instrumental, which is very conscious political action, okay? So, spending on lobbying, campaign donations, things like this, conscious action to change the policy. Or, as John was discussing, discursive policy or ideological power is the broad framework, okay? And then structural power, basically if you carry out any policy which isn't conducive to the interests of business, business will automatically punish you, or in this case financial markets will automatically punish you, okay? And what I'm going to focus on mostly is instrumental power and structural power, because I take it in the case of the FTT, we can say for argument's sake that the very reason the FTT came up in the first place was because there was an ideological delegitimization of the financial industry, okay? And there was a push to say, okay, we want these guys to pay a contribution towards the economic crisis that they caused. Okay, so the FTT initiative, it was first introduced at the G20 level in around 2008, 2009. The main players who were pushing it were Gordon Brown, Sarkozy, Peer Steinbrück from Germany. But this was rejected out of hand by the US, okay? And I should say that if you want to implement an FTT, the optimum level that you implement it at is the global level, okay? Because then you undercut any potential for relocation by the financial industry to try and escape the tax, okay? However, the US rejected it out of hand, but because there was a lot of momentum and because the momentum was coming in particular from EU states, it was pushed then at the EU 27 level. However, of course, at the EU 27 level you have lots of different states with different national priorities, and primarily the UK under the Cameron government was completely against the idea. Brown had left at that point, and when the Cameron government came in, they're very closely interlinked with the City of London, so they rejected it. And nevertheless, 11 EU countries decided to pursue the FTT on a unilateral basis, okay? And the main countries here, Germany, France, Italy and Spain, were really the drivers of these policies, okay? And this again is where you can see that the ideological delegitimization of the financial industry was very real after the crisis. So these 11 countries, they decided to pursue it under what's called enhanced cooperation. That basically means that EU countries can pursue a policy that they all agree upon if you get 9 or more members to go ahead with it, okay? So a bit of background then to the detail of the policy. Because they were pursuing it at the EU 11 level as opposed to EU 27 or globally, what was critical is how the policy is actually designed, because what you want to do is you want to prevent the financial industry from adapting their trading strategies or from relocating to just escape the tax, okay? So what you find is that the EU Commission came along in 2012 and they came up with a very, very aggressive FTT proposal, unlike a lot of FTT proposals that happen at the national state level, okay? So the proposal was you put a 0.1% tax on stocks and bonds and a 0.01% tax on derivatives. And they estimated that this would bring in annually 34 billion per year. And 13 billion of those will come from the stocks and bonds, but 21 billion comes from derivatives. So this shows you that the level of speculation that actually occurs in the EU, that you're getting such tax revenue from the derivatives themselves. But crucially then, in terms of the design, they put in a couple of clauses into the policy, which was designed to really prevent the financial industry from escaping this tax. And the first one they put in is the AAA approach, okay? And this says that the FTT will apply to all markets, all actors, and all transactions. So you have very, very limited exemptions, and this is how it differs from other transaction taxes which have been pursued at the national level. Usually what you find is there will be exemptions for intermediaries, there will be exemptions for pension funds, and different derivatives, things like this, you know, parts of the industry that they want to protect. The Commission said, no, we'll put a small charge and we'll apply to absolutely everybody. Even more important than that, they came up with anti-evasion measures. Now these are a bit complicated kind of legislative measures, but they basically relied on two principles, a residence principle and an issuance principle. And so therefore, what would matter in terms of collecting the tax is that it does not matter where you trade, but who is trading. Okay, so even if you have a German firm trading in Hong Kong, they will have to pay the tax, all right? More importantly, and to illustrate by another example, let's say, for example, you have a Hong Kong hedge fund trading with a UK hedge fund, okay? Both of those are outside of the European Union. But if they're trading, say for example, a share in a French company, like Nestle or something like this, both of them will be included in the taxation charge. So you can see it casts a very wide net, and this was very controversial because it's kind of, it goes outside of the general jurisdiction that, you know, you would regularly see the FTT apply to, okay? So ultimately, the Commission's proposal then meant that if financial firms wanted to escape the charge, or if they were to adapt, they can adapt their strategies, so if they want to escape the charge through relocation, they would actually have to forgo interaction with the entire EU11 economic area. And given that the EU11 represents such a large, is such a large part of global GDP, and particularly European GDP, this isn't a very profitable or viable strategy, okay? Okay, so I'll go through a little bit on who were the main supporters. I mentioned there Germany, Italy, France, Italy and Spain. But what's interesting is that you find that these countries tend to be less financialized than other countries. So if you see here the relative levels of financialization, the amount of their economy that depends on the financial industry is a lot less compared to a lot of the countries that decided to stay out of it. Cyprus, Ireland, United Kingdom, Malta. So roughly, they have roughly half the dependence that those countries have in the financial industry. Luxembourg, of course, is off the chart. So that's certainly one reason why they could push for it. The European Commission is a very interesting supporter, particularly because they were it's a very neoliberal European Commission. They were the ones who have always pushed before the crisis for deregulating the financial industry, liberalizing it, having a kind of integrated financial capital markets, okay? But of course, the European Commission, given its political position, also has to deal with the fiscal crisis of the European Union. So what you found is that they shifted, very much unlike the ECB. The ECB would have been very pro-financial industry, and they've kept to that stance after the crisis. But this is unlike the European Commission, which has now started to insulate themselves from the lobbying of financial institutions and things like this, okay? European Parliament, well, that's not surprising. They're very close to the leading member states, but also they'd be very close, they'd be closer to civil society concerns, like trade unions, like NGOs and things like this who were supporting the FTT. And also, civil society and public opinion was very much supportive of the FTT. If we look at this from Eurobarometer, you'll see that only 3 out of 27 publics in the EU actually oppose the FTT charge. And what's strange about it is that even countries that are outside the FTT actually support, their populations support the FTT. So if you look at Ireland, Sweden, Luxembourg, Czech Republic, they all report majorities who actually support an FTT even though their government is against it. And even in the UK, where you've had the most kind of vociferous opponent of the FTT, it's almost a match, 41 to 44 opposed, okay? So these were the key factors behind support for the financial transaction tax. So how did it fail? Right. Well, it failed because in 2014, this was the implementation deadline that the European Commission had said, okay, by the start of 2014, we want the tax implemented. That implementation date was missed, and then they came to a rushed agreement later on, and they watered down the tax very much. But who were the people behind this? Well, what you find when you look into it is that it's primarily transnational financial sector associations, okay? And I picked just 3 of them, AFME, Fund and Asset Management Association, and the Swaps and Derivatives Association. But there's actually a plethora of these financial sector associations across the whole industry. Hedge funds, fund managers, banking, every single repo markets, all these different types. And what you find is that financial institutions that will be a member of one of these will also be a member of the other networks as well, okay? Because they're involved in each part of the financial market. So you get this strong kind of organic interlink between all these financial sector associations, which means they can have a more unified message. And when you read their impact assessments from diverse groups, you find that they are very much on message. They're very much saying the same thing over and over again, okay? They also had the help from a lot of, I should say these are incredibly well-funded organisations as well. I didn't put the figures in, but if you look at the figures, I mean, these 3 groups are in the top 10 for all groups that lobby the European Union, okay? And I think there's 2 other financial groups that are in the top 10, so finance tends to be the most well spent in terms of lobbyists in the EU. They also had the support of financialised member states, as I mentioned earlier. The UK is the biggest supporter of the financial industry in this case. The Cameron government even brought a case to the ECJ. This was in relation to the extraterritoriality of the tax, okay? Luxembourg, Ireland, all these countries that are heavily financialised. What you also find is that professional service firms, even though they kind of give off this impression that they're a neutral body, that it gives advice to the government in terms of what the correct tax policy is, what you find is that they're actually associated with all these firms. If you look up these firms' executive members list, PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG, they're all connected in with these firms, okay? And if you actually read their documents, you'll find that without fail, they're against the FTT charge, and they're giving advice to government on this basis, okay? So you find that they're very much an ally of the financial industry as well. However, I would argue that the most important actors that led to this watering down of the tax were vocal opposition from non-financial corporations and central banks, okay? And this brings up evidence of what's called actor plurality thesis in the literature. And this basically states that if the financial industry can get groups from outside the financial industry to lobby with them if they can tie their interest to those groups, and those groups decide to lobby on it, then they can leverage their influence over the policy process. And this happened very much in the case of NFCs and central banks. In the case of NFCs, all their main association groups across Europe came together at the behest of the financial industry, and basically they said, okay, look, this is going to cost us more to raise capital, but also NFCs carry out a lot of treasury interactions. When they're doing their corporate treasury books, they need to engage in a lot of derivatives for hedging and all this type of stuff. So they were saying this is going to hurt us a lot. And these arguments were very powerful in the context of economic crisis, okay? Because the main thing that governments are thinking about is, you know, how is this going to impact on jobs and how is this going to impact on our competitiveness? Central bankers as well were a huge defender as well, or opponent of the FTT charge. And this came directly after financial sector associations that I mentioned earlier started writing numerous letters to the main central banks across Europe saying that, look, this is going to destroy what's called the repo market. The repo market is very important to central banks because this is a way in which they can transmit their monetary policy. And they were saying this is essentially going to destroy the repo market and it's going to hurt your transmission of monetary policy. So what you found in mid-2013 is all these leading central bankers across Europe, Heinz Weidmann of Germany, Christian Neuer of France, Mervyn King of the UK, and even Draghi, they all came out and said, look, this FTT charge, particularly how it's designed, is actually really going to be negative for the economy. It'll hurt us in terms of monetary transmission, and it's not a good policy. So you can see that it was very much all based on structural dependency arguments. Okay, you'll hurt the repo markets, you'll hurt economic recovery, bad for business, and you'll decrease EU competitiveness. And the death of the FTT basically came quite recently there, mid-2014, okay? It was primarily driven by France. Hollande in 2013 had done his volte-face, his re-engagement with private business in France in order to focus on national competitiveness, okay? And they were the ones who first brought up the idea, you know what, maybe we shouldn't apply the transaction tax to all different transactions, particularly derivatives, which is very important for the Paris stock market, okay? So basically what you had then is you had division at the European Council level. They couldn't get an agreement on how we should actually implement the charge. They missed the January 2014 implementation deadline. And what they decided to do was come to a rush deal just before the EU elections, EU parliamentary elections in May 2014. And what the conclusion that they came to is we'll have a new implementation date, 2 years' time in 2016, but crucially they now decided that we're going to have a wide variety of exemptions, okay? And all of a sudden the expected revenue intake went from 34 billion down to 3.5 billion, 1/10 of the original proposal. The irony in this is that when you actually open up the taxation charge to those exemptions, what you will find is that financial institutions will adapt their trading strategies, so you mightn't even get the 3.5 billion. It's very unlikely it's going to work at this point. So yeah, I would say the FTT ultimately is another instance of a watered down regulation policy which has been watered down, and another example of how the democratic function of the EU is thwarted by financial political power. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Cool. I just want to preface this by saying that most of this isn't actually based on my PhD work, just a small part of it is, hence the reflections part in the title. So with nearly 6 months having passed since the European parliamentary elections and the local elections, now is an apt a time as any to discuss the general attitude of both the elite leadership of the EU and others towards the general population. Having taken place within the context of an EU-wide recession, along with austerity measures having been introduced in a number of EU countries, the election results were never going to be entirely surprising. Anger is palpable amongst wide swathes of the population, with leaders coming across as either indifferent towards or ignorant of the wishes of the citizenry. Of course, this applies to Ireland just as much as certain other countries in the EU, such as Greece and Spain. The election results, in which right-wing and Eurosceptic parties received large portions of the vote, engendered shock amongst the established political parties, leaders and their wider echelon. Similarly, and of note, the same attitude was shown towards the successive left-wing parties and individuals in the elections. Here in Ireland, the reaction of the then Minister for Communications, Energy and Natural Resources, Pat Rabbitte, was telling. Rhetorically, he asked, where would the country be now if the election results of the EU and local elections had in actuality been the results of a general election? Such an attitude directed towards citizens engaging in the democratic process was apparently uncontroversial. What was controversial and of concern was that they had given an incorrect answer to the democratic question posed to them: who should lead? With the established political parties struggling to retain, let alone increase their popularity and membership, this question will become more and more salient over the coming months and years. But the question itself, who should lead, in its current form has several things implied in it. First of all is the obvious implication that the citizenry need leaders due to their inability or ineptitude to lead themselves. Secondly, and more important and relevant for the discussion here, is that it is not an open-ended question. Certain answers are acceptable, whereas others are to be shunned, mocked and or suppressed where possible. To give an unacceptable answer is to undermine the system or cause a crisis. Such an attitude towards the citizenry is nothing new. For that reason, before discussing the current issues facing the democratic system in the EU, I want to first look back to the 1960s and 1970s. This time period is worth looking at, as it was a time of massive demonstrations on both sides of the Atlantic by people demanding equal rights, demanding an end to war, and generally demanding social change from their leaders whom they considered to have failed in their duty to create an equal society in the post-war years. Ideas and attitudes from this time period still simmer slightly below the surface today, hence why a brief digression and examination of this topic is worthwhile. Another and more important reason for looking at the time period in question is that the reaction of the elite leadership then was similar to the reactions we see today. In both academic and political circles, the reaction to the mass mobilization of the citizenry was a mix of horror and confusion. The traditional top-down approach to governance was apparently about to collapse. Of course it didn't, but nonetheless some rights were won by the population where they had previously had none. This mass civil engagement became the basis of an apparently long-forgotten report by the Trilateral Commission, which was published in 1975. What follows is largely based on its findings. Published in 1975, the Crises of Democracy, report on the governability of democracies to the Trilateral Commission, examined in some detail the causes and effects of the active citizenry that emerged in the 1960s and early 1970s in Europe, the United States and in Japan. Written by three leading academics for the NGO, it is premised on the idea that a previously apathetic citizenry became more active and therefore undermined the credibility and functioning of democracy. Europe is of special interest for us here for obvious reasons. Although the introduction states that the report is designed to make democracy stronger, the definition of democracy being worked off is a top-down approach to governance in which the population is preferably apathetic, passive and stratified. All three authors wondered how to make democracy not more democratic or effective in the popular understanding of the term, but how to enable a return to the previous state of affairs of an apathetic, passive and stratified citizenry. So, what was the crisis of democracy that was identified in the report? It was a breakdown of traditional means of social control, a delegitimation of political and other forms of authority, and an overload of demands on government exceeding its capacity to respond. An increase of social interaction resulted in the breakdown of the means of traditional social control imposed upon the individual by collective authorities, especially the state, and by hierarchical religious institutions. In turn, this meant that citizens resist any kind of social control that is associated with the hierarchical values they have learned to discard and reject. Individuality was seen to have usurped traditional civic values and stratification, and therefore people were more free than ever to choose their jobs, friends, partners, and general future than ever before. At the very least, the wider population had decided that they could make those decisions for themselves without government interference. Added to this was the change in access to information. Quite simply, people had more access to information than was previously the case. A crisis of democracy, as the authors defined it, was a critical, active and informed citizenry. So, what were their solutions to this perceived crisis? As they had noted from the outset, the premise that democracy meant free and open participation of the masses was not entirely correct. Returns diminished the more open the system was. European democracies had always been built on subtle screening of participants and demands. Therefore, the crisis was caused because this traditional model of screening and government by distance has gradually broken down. In order to end the crisis, the obvious solution was to return to some form of screening or reassertion of the traditional forms of hierarchy in society. Individuals and groups, it was declared, would have to learn to show more self-restraint, as otherwise governance would apparently become completely impossible. On top of this, new methods of control would also have to be constructed, which relied on less coercion than in previous times, but nonetheless gave the same returns in the form of social control and acquiescence. Passivity would have to be reintroduced in some manner. So that was the reaction to the culture of the 1960s and 1970s. So what about today? The opinion of the population towards the EU system is quite telling in this regard, and so is the opinion of elites in their reaction to the attitudes and ideas of the wider population. Voter turnouts have consistently fallen according to the polling data, this year bucking that trend only slightly, with voter turnout stabilising at 43.1%. Nonetheless, the same report notes that turnout for the European elections fell by almost 19 points between 1979 and 2009, from 61.99% to 43%. The late political scientist Peter Mayer also took note of this decline in Europe. He pointed out that not only has voter turnout declined consistently, but party membership has collapsed in kind. Voters, he argues, are less loyal to their former party or parties of choice, and are instead showing more volatility in their voting decisions. There is, all things considered, less commitment to parties on the part of voters. But Mayer also points out another important aspect in the decline of democracy in Europe. He considers the hollowing of democracy to be mutual on the part of the citizenry and the elite. As he writes, just as citizens retreat to their own private and particularised spheres of interest, so too the political and party leaders retreat into their own version of this private and particular sphere, which is constituted by the closed world of governing institutions. Both individual European democracies and the EU system itself have reinforced top-down governance. That is, government has moved from being the mutuality of government by the people and for the people to the singular of government for the people. An apathetic citizenry is absent from government and governance, therefore they must be governed for by others appropriately qualified. Of course, this is nothing new. In a lecture in Leuven, Belgium last year, Jürgen Habermas pointed out that the European Union owes its existence to the efforts of political elites who could count on the passive consent of their more or less indifferent populations as long as the peoples could regard the Union as also being in their economic interests, all things considered. What seems to be new is that this method of governance appears to be seeping from supranational institutions such as the EU system down to individual democracies. Leaders feel they cannot rely on the citizenry, who are either too apathetic or too boisterous to be allowed to have much of a say in decisions affecting their kith and kin. Added to this is the fact that on the national level, leaders themselves feel hamstrung by orders which come down to them from supranational institutions such as the EU. Populism in its turn has become a dirty word, used to denigrate any kind of politics which strays from the accepted mainstream. Whilst the dictionary definition of populism or populist is that it means representing the interests of ordinary people, the definition used by leaders associates it with extremist movements and unviable ideas. This attitude can also be seen in mainstream publications, such as Foreign Affairs. For example, a recent article published in its pages by Yasha Monk was entitled "Pitchfork Politics, the Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy." While conflating both right-wing and left-wing movements, he writes that if populists win greater power, they are likely to compound existing injustices and inequalities by giving more to the discontented majority and by taking from minorities that already have less, in both material and social terms, than they deserve. At the same time, he considers saving the generous welfare states of North America and Western Europe as unsustainable, with raising the retirement age and loosening of labour regulations being possible solutions to the general malaise of populism as he defines it. This brings me to the crux of the argument I want to make. Citizenship, as generally considered, involves access to rights, civil, political and social rights. That is, once you are a citizen, you have access to these rights guaranteed. If a leadership provides these rights, then all, at least technically, should be well. But this is clearly not the case. This is a shallow view of citizenship and its concomitant rights. In reality, there is much more to these rights and how they function than is generally thought. In his now classic account, T.H. Marshall pointed out that the rights we now associate with citizenship emerged in a slow and sometimes violent process. Until this happened, certain rights were only held by certain people. The right to vote, for example, was held at various times only by rich landowners, at other times white landowners, and again later only male landowners. The process of the evolution of citizenship rights negated and did away with previous injustices, at least in theory, but also sometimes in practice. Regarding the latter, before the modern idea of social rights in Britain, claims for social provision due to ill health, unemployment, etc. were dealt with under the Poor Law. This was an extremely regressive law in that in order to claim social provisions under it, one had to forfeit their other rights. As Marshall wrote, people ceased to be citizens in any true sense of the word once they claimed the mentioned provisions. The result was that paupers forfeited in practice the civil rights of personal liberty by internment in the workhouse, and they forfeited by law any political rights they might possess. Marshall's account has also been criticised due to the fact that access to rights in theory did not mean access to them in practice. This is part of the point that I want to make. Citizenship is an interlinking matrix of rights that consists of much more than Marshall's now widely popularised account of civil, political and social rights. This is something that Marshall did not take into consideration. In fact, in a large amount of the literature, it is just taken for granted that access to citizenship and becoming a citizen means a person is protected, that they have unimpeded access to the rights that go along with it. But this is simply incorrect. Marshall's concept of civil, political and social rights, which for the sake of convenience we'll call primary rights, have sub-rights implied in them. So the following table can help illustrate this. Okay. What I'm pointing out is that when certain rights are undermined or withheld, this has a knock-on effect on other rights. When some rights are affected, it creates a feedback loop. It undermines a person's citizenship. I call this non-citizenship. So, to give one example, we can look briefly at social rights. If a person is a citizen of a particular state or becomes one, then it is automatically assumed that they have full access to their primary rights, such as their social rights. However, this may not be the case. If their right to the security of their person is undermined or completely negated, then this is obviously going to have an effect on their other rights. In this case, one of the more obvious ones, at least within the context of the EU, being their political right to vote. That is, they may be pressured or coerced into voting a specific way, thereby undermining their social right of security of person and their political right to vote. In turn, this undermines their civil right of freedom of speech. This relationship exists across all of the primary rights and sub-rights. So let us take the political right to vote as our starting point this time. Voting, as stated above, is essentially an act of free speech. A person is declaring their support, openly or not, for a particular political party or individual. This right can be completely suppressed or only limited. It can theoretically exist, but it can be made either too dangerous to vote, or, as seems to be the case today in many countries, including countries of the West, made too expensive in terms of investment of time and money. The obvious knock-on effect of this undermining of a person's right to vote is that it undermines a person's freedom of speech and their right to security of their person, both of which come under the rubrics of civil and social rights respectively. Furthermore, if voting rights are undermined in some manner, then, as in many cases in reality, it is those from lower socio-economic backgrounds whose voting rights tend to be undermined. People who are likely to be amongst the most affected by the decisions of governments simply vote in less and less numbers. So, what is the result of this? Recent history shows us that their social rights are undermined, such as a right to education, healthcare, and a basic standard of living. By conflating citizenship with primary rights, and only primary rights, it allows governments and leaders to mask rights abuses of their citizens. Citizenship, as a term, has come to act as a conceptual cover for states. I term it non-citizenship because of this conceptual covering which takes place. I also term it this for the simple reason that many people who are legal citizens are simply not citizens in the fullest sense of the term when considering primary rights and sub-rights. It is only the combination of both which gives us full citizenship. So, to conclude, this takes us back to Mayer's point. Governments, and in particular the EU, have overtly shifted to a case of government for the people minus government by the people. Leaders have come to believe in their own propaganda that once people are provided for in terms of citizenship, they should be content. What they fail to realise or simply ignore is that there is much more to citizenship than the primary rights I outlined above. Even Mayer's critique of the current system presupposes the centrality of primary rights, whilst failing to acknowledge any kind of sub-rights. For example, he refers to the populace as apathetic and individualistic, and are therefore a part of the current problem in Western democracies. What he fails to acknowledge, and isn't even mentioned once in his work, is alienation. One simple and rather obvious example of what causes alienation is nothing more than a lack of the sub-rights mentioned. That is, people are more tuned in and aware of what the important issues facing society are than his model, or one can imagine most of the models take into account. People are quite aware of what needs fixing in society, but in the case of Europe, and especially Ireland after years of austerity and cutbacks, people aren't sure how to change things. Solutions to the problems of citizenship and democracy are many, and in my view rather obvious. However, it's beyond the scope of what I'm trying to achieve here to try and proffer solutions. That is a discussion for elsewhere. For the moment, the problems need to be identified before we can begin tackling them. Of course, this is a truism, but truisms are often dismissed or overlooked. An analysis such as the one presented can hopefully identify some of the challenges facing the EU system. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Egon?
Yeah, I have a quick question to Manolis, later of the first speaker as well. I just wonder in terms of the opposition to the financial transaction tax you identify that was mounted by various financial corporations. Do you have any information about the level of internal division there might be in deciding whether or how to frame that opposition? Is there ever a voice within the financial sector that says, guys, if only to free us from some of the political heat we're under, or to tap into ethical investment funds, we really should do X, Y, and Z? Or is it it's presented as quite a cohesive block, and I just wonder might there be divisions within it?
That's where I found that there was actually a lot of cohesion, and I was wondering where it came from. In one way, it was obviously, as I said, you know, all these different associations are interlinked. They have overlapping memberships, okay? But I found another factor of cohesion was the big four tax accountancy firms, PwC and all that. And what you find constantly in their advice to financial institutions, you know, reports that they'll write on the FTT for financial institutions, is that they started saying around the end of 2012, start of 2013, that the financial industry shouldn't be against the FTT in its entirety, because it looks like political leaders are very determined to get this passed. What they should do is they should focus on exemptions within their own particular subsector of the financial industry. And then you start to see that their strategy started doing that. So each subsector started coming out with impact assessments on their sector and targeting other people, like, for example, repo markets. They started targeting central bankers, saying repo markets are very important for you, let's get an exemption for this. So it was very much gut the tax as opposed to get the tax completely defeated, you know. So accountancy firms expect some sort of FTT, but I suppose they're thinking that the best scenario is that there'll be so many exemptions that it won't hit the financial industry too much, and to the extent that it does, you can adapt your trading to go around it. So I did find a lot of cohesion among the financial industry. I didn't find any financial actor saying, there are some individual elites, people like George Soros, who say we do need to scale back the financial industry, we should have a financial transaction tax. But as an institution, and no, there was none that said, I think an FTT is a good idea.
It's just like, let's say something else on that. Just in terms of Ireland, it's more broadly even from the FTT. There's a lot of, you would think there's some divide between business groups when you start to look at IBEC and ISME and groups that have different kind of interests within different business sectors. There's a really, really cohesive opinion about most things, even in terms of cuts in the income tax reductions that were introduced in the budget as well. But like for me, ISME is very difficult to understand because they're very keen on cutting the public service very strongly, reducing public spending, but effectively all their small and medium-term enterprises are relying on public sector spending in the economy, in the domestic economy and the domestic economy as a whole. But a lot of the policies they're advocating seem to be deflationary to the domestic economy. But when you start to look at it, you see that some of the senior figures in the representative groups overlap with IBEC, overlap with the Big Four as well. There's a very much a kind of a big circle that are kind of overlapping with directorships. TAS did a report a couple of years ago called Mapping the Golden Circle, I think it's called, but it goes through all of the different private companies in Ireland and the overlapping directorships and how much they're tied in together, and that seems to be a factor in that as well, why that happens.
Yeah, sorry, one comment, one question to the first speaker, John. I think it'd be useful to strengthen your case with regards to the financial transactions tax. If you mentioned the fact that Ireland already implements a financial transactions tax partially, that it applies a stamp duty of 1% on shares traded, whereas the UK only implements this tax at 0.5%. So there's already a very large differential in taxation between Ireland and the UK on shares, and this hasn't led to a migration of capital from Dublin to London. So I think that would really strengthen the case if you mentioned that. And the other question was to Manolis. So you say that the financial transactions tax gradually got watered down, but I read a paper recently that before it got scuppered, that it gradually became more and more ambitious and then got watered down. So when it was very first suggested, I don't think repo markets were included in the proposed net of the FTT, and that gradually the Commission became more and more ambitious in its scope. So I'm just wondering, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I know that paper as well. I forget the author, but I think what he's, sorry?
Daniela Garber.
Yeah. I think what the author is referring to in that context is that there was a debate about whether you should have an FTT or an FAT, financial activities tax, which was you would apply a tax to profits as opposed to actual transactions themselves, okay? But there was two reasons why this was dropped. One is that it would have no impact on actual trading, so there wouldn't be any kind of regulatory merit to an FAT because its profits already made, okay? So it wouldn't disincentivize certain transactions that you don't want to carry out, or that the Commission wouldn't like to see carried out, that destabilize markets. And the other reason is that you'd have to put it at a very high level to garner anywhere near the revenues that the FTT would take. So what I kind of take as the baseline is the introduction of the Commission's first proposal. They introduced two proposals, and their first proposal with a huge impact assessment report, over 1,000 words, and they implemented that policy, or they recommended the policy on the basis of the AAA, all markets, all transactions, all institutions. And I take that as the kind of baseline. and they stuck with that for the second proposal because that was for the EU 27. Then the second proposal in 2013 was for the EU 11, and they stayed with those main criteria. So I think that might explain it.
Any other questions? Queries?
Just for Bryan,
Comments?
just a question for Bryan. Bryan, in relation to the citizenship rights, and you're talking about the international covenant on civil and political rights and the international covenant on economic, social and cultural rights. Does that not override the argument as such that it's impacting a lot on the sovereignty of the citizenship state, whereby the citizen can now, or the non-citizen can now rely on the international courts to uphold their rights such as a citizen, a human being, or is that not taking place more often now?
Yeah, in some cases, but it also relies on states respecting the findings of, the International Criminal Court or whoever. Like the United States, for example, has, told the ICC to get lost in the mid-80s when they were, Nicaragua brought them to the International Criminal Court, and the ICC found in favor of Nicaragua, and America chose to ignore the findings. I mean, you are right. I mean that legal provision exists for citizens and non-citizens, but I think it's a very tenuous. It's a very tenuous framework. I think there isn't enough enforcement. I mean, for example, the Palestinian could bring, the IDF, the Israeli army, to make claims against them, under the Geneva Convention or the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. But I mean, is somebody like Israel going to abide by, whatever findings are made? I mean, it's states pick and choose as they see fit, according to their whims, really. But you're right. I mean, that does exist, and it can be. I think it can be used as a tool to kind of threaten states to kind of get your act together. But it just needs. Personally, I think it needs a lot more reinforcement. Like I think the UN, for example, unlike many of my other fellow travellers on the left, I think the UN is theoretically a fantastic organisation. There is so much potential for it there, especially in terms of peacekeeping. But in practice, it's very tenuous. So I think a lot of these things need greater reinforcement in the international sphere. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not.
Thanks, Bryan.
Anyone else?
Chair is not supposed to. Chair is not supposed to be station.
I do have a question for Bryan, actually. I know it's, yeah, just in terms of central banks. I mean, you mentioned Peter Mayer's work, and he talks a lot. So one thing he was saying is that populations are less devoted to one party anymore. They can move around. But he also says the other side of it, from elite's perspective, is the decisions now are very much depoliticized, and they're kind of retrenching into kind of technocratic bodies and all this type of stuff. And central banks, and the ECB in particular, is an incredible representative of this. I mean, with the Trichet letter quite recently, we can see they're overstepping their mandate. They're supposed to be a depoliticized body, but also, I mean, just 2 weeks ago, they took over the supervision of 6,000 banks across the EU. So they're responsible for these macro-prudential policies, like the one that's coming into Ireland, where you have to have 20% deposit on a house to get a house, So they're now reaching into more and more policies, yet they're apparently a depoliticized body, and you can't have any democratic check over them. So I wonder if that fits into your work in any way. I know it's more a comment than a question, but how the ECB or economic rights will fit into it.
Well, I don't know if I said it to you earlier, but like my actual PhD work isn't on Europe whatsoever.
All right. Well, then we take it as a
but yeah, I mean, like I'm looking specifically at Israel, but there will be, there's kind of a corollary there. There are institutions who would impact on say, legal citizens of Israel, but are beyond the reach of said citizens, you know, like say the Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court. It's a lot of kind of liberal Israelis hold it up as, you know, an example of, you know, the democratic ethos, etc., etc. But first of all, it's very difficult to get a case that far, especially as a Palestinian or somebody else. And secondly, they tend to be, I mean, they're Supreme Court judges, you know, they're a conservative bunch, you know. So that's, yeah, I mean, they're technically a depoliticized organization, but they're very politicized. I mean, one of the former Supreme Court judges of the Israeli Supreme Court a few years ago, he retired and he said, you know, Israel is the land of the Jewish people, and, you know, he's defining, you know, the Jewish people, as a nation, when that's very problematic in terms of their citizenship policies, you know, because the state is defined as the state of the Jewish people. It's not defined as the state of its citizens. So, but yeah, I mean, you're right, like, I mean, these supposedly depoliticized organizations exist, but they're very politicized.
It's pretty true in every country, though.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's correct. It varies, you know, to different degrees.
I'm going to break the rule and ask kind of a common sense question. One thing I found very interesting, I think the three papers overlap and mutually reinforce in interesting ways, but it would be nice to see the question of democracy, we like, as it were, politics and economics to be really closer integrated. And I was struck by this issue of wanting the apathetic citizen. And it's dodgy in my memory, but I think it's early chapters of Icon Green and it's part of Polanyi, that there appears to be, when you have financial power in the saddle of the state, which is not historically always been the case, you can have manufacturing power, that goes hand in hand with needing a citizenry with minimalist social demands and minimalist claims upon the state. And you have this in the classical liberal period of the 19th century. Then you have the strange thing that happened in the 20th century. And that it would seem that there's kind of a historical coincidence between the rise of financial power and this push towards the apathetic, disenchanted citizenry. And my kind of question would be, I would like to see, or at least explore, these kind of links that might be quite particular to financial power, and that you could have manufacturing capital will not necessarily be supportive of minimalizing social demands. And if you have a look at, you know, the model ideal notions of the welfare state and welfare capital, that involve very, very expansion of the welfare state, strong compacts and agreements between manufacturing capital, trade unions and labour. You had a compact between organised labour and organised capital, that there seems to be some correlation between the stories we're getting of financial power and the story you're telling us about this desire and attempt to engineer the appropriate citizenry for a form of rule in which financial power is in the saddle. Is it Icon Green who does it in the early chapters of that, the globalization of...
Sure.
I think maybe it's my memory, and he's drawing on Polanyi on that.
But I mean, in terms of what you said there, the contrast between manufacturing and financial, you see, I think that's been broken down an awful lot now. If you look over the neoliberal period, you don't find any evidence of a clash between manufacturing and financial.
Granted.
Yeah.
As in now, but the point being, if you're looking at the 50s and 60s and 70s, you had organisations for industry, and the bankers were at loggerheads over monetary policy and everything else.
Absolutely, and that's why, you know, the financial industry was purposefully restrained. I mean, if you look at Glass-Steagall in the US, there are also capital controls to stop, you know, flight and all this.
See the amount of manufacturing companies that have expanded into financial areas as well, so like General Motors, that became effectively financial institutions. So I guess that's blurred since, and it's harder to make that distinction now.
An interesting fact, Brayburn, which is a type of apple, is Apple's hedge fund, and they're larger than any hedge fund working out of the UK. So where is manufacturing making its profits from? To a large extent, it's making it from the financial industry. So its interests are very intertwined. But I think the point you make then about what about small and medium-sized businesses? Michael Taft always makes the point that if he was a member of ISME, the first thing he'd do is he'd take away their membership, because you're undercutting your own economic growth by having a deflationary policy in the domestic economy.
And one little just comment, and then maybe if there's any more from the floor, and then there's caffeine outside, I believe. I don't know how much, this is for John, I don't know how much focus you're, in terms of the empirical material, the methodology you're using, the style of analysis you're using, how much is going to be content analysis, how much of it is going to be quantitative, comparative, to what extent you're trying to assemble evidence to corroborate the Chomsky propaganda model of media, or to what extent you are paying attention to the way in which the way in which things are expressed. I mean, you get some quotes about suicide and be a fatal blow and stuff like that. When I was seeing that, I was struck by, I was reminded of, Albert Hirschman's The Rhetoric of Reaction.
Yeah.
And it's a study of it's a study of discursive reactions. If I remember, one is to the abolition of slavery. There's another to the introduction of the vote for the women, and I think the third is the welfare state. He's looking at these three periods where there's big changes, and he analysed the patterns. And he's saying that within the discourse there's a repertoire. He calls it the rhetoric of reaction, and I can remember two of them. You get the perversity argument that what you're going to do. Oh, you have all this plan. You're going to, financial tax, the Robin Hood tax. It's going to help smooth it. No. It'll make things worse. It's actually going to have perverse consequences, not the imagined one. The futility argument is that you think it's going to accomplish things. Actually, it will be useless because, as we know, there'll be capital flight, there'll be blah, 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 blah. And can anyone help me? What was the third argument? I can't remember what the third one is. It's been a while. But it might. If you are going to be doing anything in your thesis where you're going to be doing that kind of qualitative analysis and looking at discursive patterns, I think it's a nice model. And he too has he's originally an economist long before you.
Thanks, sir.
So. Anyone else? So do I smell coffee? Is it time for coffee? Can we give them all a round of applause, please?